in a specific country. That's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that's international law. So we would be happy with one state or two states, so long as the three rights are respected. You claimed that I said in a video that I wanted to see Palestine next to a Palestine, not Israel next to a Palestine. This fabrication was made, I'll get to it, I'll explain to it, I know exactly what I said and where I said it. This fabrication was brought by many Zionist groups, Stand With Us, and all the lobby groups in this country. And it actually reached the New York Times pages. Roger Cohen reported it, very blindly, following some very right-wing fanatic Zionist groups in this country. I corrected Roger Cohen, sending him evidence about the whole video. What I said then, and what I will repeat anytime, was in fact the following. Sari Nusseir, the president of Al-Quds University, who's still alive, always made that remark, that if we insist on the right of return, the refugees would return to what's now Israel, then it will not be an Israel next to a Palestine, but a Palestine next to a Palestine. Those are the exact words of Professor Sari Nusseir of Al-Quds University, whom I completely disagree with. I would never condone such a statement. But Sari Nusseir's conclusion is, maybe we should consider foregoing the right of return. That's his position. My personal position, not as a BDS representative, is maybe we should forego the political solution that prevents the return, because human rights are above any political solution. People deserve their rights regardless of the political outcome. That was my position. That was entirely taken out of context, repackaged, and sent through the blogosphere, through the Israel lobby. The last point, because I don't want to miss any part, you mentioned that I oppose, quote, cooperation between Israelis and Palestinians. Interesting. In my presentation, I did mention very clearly that any attempt to reconcile the relations between the oppressors and the oppressed without addressing oppression are necessarily unethical. And I'm opposed to any unethical relations. I am all for cooperation excuse me, between Israelis and Palestinians to co-resist oppression. We make a distinction between coexistence under oppression or co-resistance to oppression. This is a young Palestinian colleague came up with this excuse me, term. So co-resistance is certainly a form of cooperation, but it's an ethical form of cooperation. It doesn't make sense for Afrikaners and blacks to do Romeo and Juliet together under apartheid without taking a position against apartheid. It just does not make sense. It's unethical. It did not make sense during the civil rights struggle in this country for blacks and whites to claim that they're equal and to maybe co-author a book about love in Burma. Whatever, I'm just making this up. That's unethical because it gives the false impression of parity, of symmetry, which is not true and it's unethical. But if people from the oppressor community and from the oppressed community cooperate to end oppression, and therefore they create the conditions for ethical coexistence, I'm all for it.
We'll take a question here and then. Any other questions or even comments? You make your way out to Mark.
I've got a few quick comments, and I think I can keep it to 2 minutes. I first just want to say that there is somebody here who's videotaping, so people might want to consider avoiding further shouting. I actually agreed with much more than I expected with the presentation, and I found it much more reasonable than I expected. But during the Q&A, I was shocked actually by something that you said. Particularly, you said that certain particular people that you named declined to debate with you because they would rather pressure university presidents to cancel talks. I mean, how could you possibly know why individual people declined to debate with you? And I'm just,
okay.
Well, I just got a few quick points, if I may. Okay. And next, this is just perhaps a minor point. I think it was a mistake that you said in your talk when you said the Teachers Union of Ireland unanimously called upon its members to boycott. I think you meant to say that the leadership unanimously called, not that the the union did it unanimously. That concerns me because I see some exaggeration of consensus and some dismissing of dissensus around the boycott. But mainly my questions are as follows. That was a minute and 20 seconds. Who's going to enforce international law and guarantee equality? Who's going to do that in this case? And secondly, if we need to desist from complicity, what about the oppressions that are local and nationally here? And what about the problem of externalizing this need to avoid complicity by saying, you know, we're going to focus on Israel rather than focusing on the United States or what's happening locally?
I'm glad that Mr. Barghouti has come to speak with us. You know, it's been a very sad conflict. And there have been misdeeds on the part of Israelis, Palestinians, the British, the Jordanians. It's been sad and it's been tragic. And it's been a conflict. And I want to put emphasis on the word conflict and go to the early origins of the conflict. There was a partition that was proposed in 1947 that the Israelis accepted and the Palestinians did not accept. I think that had they accepted it, there's a possibility, who knows, that there would have been the possibility for peace in these two lands. Both peoples were living there, both peoples owned land there. There had been intercommunal tension and violence. After Israel declared independence, there was a war. And there were 5 Arab states and the Palestinians declared war. Yes, Palestinians fled and were expelled from Israel. It's a very sad episode. Jews fled and were expelled from Arab lands as well. The Israelis offered the Palestinians, the 100,000 Palestinians in 1949 to return. I'll get there. Just a moment. In 1949 to return, no. There's been efforts to trade land for peace, no. And when I say it's a conflict, and that there's been misdeeds on both sides, and there's been efforts on both sides, I'm hoping that we can continue to make those efforts. And I want to thank the Dean and the Chaz Executive Committee for agreeing to have a speaker come to UCR and provide another perspective. But I am very glad to hear Mr. Barghouti's perspective.
No problem. Thank you. I'd like to follow what that gentleman just said, basically by making a point, the question being whether you agree with me. My sense of the conflict would actually go before 1946. We could go back 100 years, 200, 300, 1,000. And I think you did a disservice to the nature of the conflict by presenting it as a simple issue of justice. There are lots of ways to look at justice. And I think if there was anything simple about this situation, it would have been resolved a year, 5 years, 15, 25, 30, 100, 200, 1,000 years ago. You are a wonderful speaker. Your descriptions are vivid. You're a tremendous advocate. But I think you do your cause a disservice by neglecting the tremendous nuance and the gray area that, to me, occupies the entire field, except for the very minimal things that are obvious, which is nobody should inflict injustice on another person. Murder is always wrong. People should be decent. You know, decent morality is agreed upon by most of us. But I didn't hear the gray in your talk, and I missed it. But thank you for being here.
Okay, the first question, people refusing to debate, if I misrepresented that to mean that the same individuals I mentioned are the ones who pressured university presidents, I apologize, that was not absolutely what I intended to say. I said it's the same sentiment, refusing to debate and doing pressuring on in the structures of power, where many of those people have a lot of power, whether access to mainstream media and so on and so forth. They prefer to express their views there without being challenged. They refuse to debate because they know in such a challenge of minds, logic, and rationales, they cannot win. And again, from this podium, I challenge them again to debate us. I'm open to debate any of our detractors who have all these kinds of claims against the BDS movement. But they're not the same individuals pressuring universities. I apologize about the misunderstanding. The Teachers Union of Ireland, at their conference, that was a unanimous vote. It wasn't the leadership, it was a conference, the general convention of the union, and that was a unanimous vote. That's Ireland. They know colonialism. They understand it. You don't need to explain it to them. To them, they were the first, the Irish, to stand with the anti-apartheid movement, to call for a boycott of South Africa. Irish artists were the very, very first to call for a boycott, and then the British and then the Americans followed. So the Irish have had a long history of standing with colonized and oppressed peoples around the world. It's not a surprise. Who enforces international law? Good question. I would like to think that through our toils, through our efforts as civil society, as mass movements around the world, we pressure for the applicability of international law in an egalitarian and just way. Because after all, international law was initiated by the powers that won World War II, not exactly by the people, by governments, by empires that wanted to carve up the world and zones of influence. But throughout the years, people, struggles all over the world have pushed the envelope on international law, have expanded what international law means. So the protection of the weaker parts of this world, the more oppressed people in this world, has become enshrined in international law. And many people say, but it's imperfect. Of course it's imperfect. But what choice do Palestinians and other oppressed communities have? It's either international law or the law of the jungle. I don't like the latter. But again, it's not an easy question. Who enforces international law? Of course, the United Nations hopefully would, but it needs a lot of grassroots struggles, as with the apartheid case in South Africa. All governments were against divesting from apartheid, ending their complicity with apartheid. But ultimately, through many, many struggles from the grassroots up, even Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher had to end relations with apartheid. Desisting from complicity, how about local struggles? Is this diverting attention from local struggles or giving an external outlet to ignore domestic struggles? Absolutely not. Actually, I'm glad you asked this question. We're not asking people to drop their causes in this country for social justice, environmental justice, food justice, LGBT rights, black rights, Latino, Chicano rights. We're not asking people to drop those causes, those struggles. Absolutely not. That would be really preposterous of us. But we would like to see our struggle organically connected with their own. We would like to see joint struggles against common targets. Corporations that are involved in the US-Mexico wall, that's oppressing immigrants' rights, and also involved in Israel's illegal wall in the occupied territories, like Elbit Systems. Companies that are privatizing your transport system here, raising the prices, and also involved in the so-called Jerusalem light rail, connecting Israel's illegal colonies with the city of Jerusalem, like Veolia. So there are targets that can promote a joint type of struggle, where struggles are interconnected, not mutually exclusive. We definitely would like to see BDS in this country integrated into general liberal and progressive causes, not to be at the expense of those causes. Okay, the second one was that it's a sad, tragic conflict, and conflict was emphasized several times. And then there was a short version of history, the 1947 partition, which Israel supposedly accepted. You mean the Zionist groups, there was no Israel then, and the Palestinians rejected it. And Israel's, quote, independence, which was May 14th, and how the Arab armies invaded, and then sadly, you called it a sad episode, half our people were ethnically cleansed. But you said, but also Jews were expelled from Arab states. Okay, let's unpack some of what's said here. It is certainly not a conflict, and that applies to the third question. A conflict is between two symmetric parties, whether one is stronger or not, but two states having a war. That's a conflict. A husband and wife, that's a conflict. Bosses and unions, that's a conflict. Colonization is not a conflict. Occupation and apartheid are not conflicts. They're oppressive relationships, where one side is the oppressor, the other is the oppressed. Now, have injustices been committed by the oppressed? Yes, in all struggles. The oppressed are never pure. And as I said earlier, I would completely condemn any attacks on civilians or non-combatants. But to end that, you've got to address oppression. Now, it is completely false that Israel ethnically cleansed the Palestinians only after its declaration of statehood. Actually, the official name is the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel. That's the Hebrew term. This independence came later in the English language, but in Hebrew it's not. It's the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Prior to the establishment of the State of Israel, a large minority of Palestinian refugees had already been expelled. Please read Professor Ilan Pape's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Of course, he's a Jewish Israeli historian, very, very accomplished, published by Cambridge and others. The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine exposes, and no Israeli historian has refuted that, the existence of a Plan Dalet. Plan Dalet, which is the D plan, was developed by Ben-Gurion and Zionist leaders to expel Palestinians years before, a long period before the partition plan, to ethnically cleanse the Palestinian majority from their homeland to establish a Jewish exclusionary state. That's undisputed by historians, including Benny Morris, who's a Zionist historian. He does not dispute the mere facts. Regardless, and that applies to the third question, so I'll answer that part of the second with the third together. Regardless of that history, which is very convoluted, the version we heard from you, the main point is that currently there's no dispute about the lack of justice for all three parts of the Palestinian people. Those in the occupied territories, those who are citizens in Israel, and those in exile, the refugees. There's no question that exists now. And there's no question that those three communities have rights under international law. That's all what the BDS movement is calling for. The so-called conflict does not go back hundreds of years. Palestinians had Christians, Muslims, and Jews all their history. They've coexisted for centuries. You're superimposing a European reality on a Middle East reality that did not see pogroms against Jews, did not see massacres against Jews in the Arab and Islamic East. This is unheard of. In fact, the height of Jewish civilization was in Andalusia under Arab rule. If you forget, we had no conflict with Jewish communities in Palestine for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. That's a very recent phenomenon, which is also reassuring for people like me to be optimistic, because people tell me, why are you optimistic? Because I know we've coexisted for centuries in the past. It's only with the advent of Zionism and ethnic cleansing that the real conflict began, which is not a conflict as I explained. So we have no reason to believe that those people have been at war forever and therefore they will never reconcile. Of course, they can and will reconcile with the end of oppression and the establishment of justice.
I just want to see if there's a notice. Anybody else who has not yet spoken who wants to? Yeah. Can you come to the microphone? I'm sorry. We signed that a long time. Please go ahead. Yes.
So, my name is Sean Hawley, and I am a senator on this campus and a student. So I'm coming at it from, in a sense, a different perspective. So I have like it's a bit of a two-part thing. So you called for